Alright everyone, it's time to talk about Venezuela a little bit again because they're back in the news. There was a new fresh wave of looting across parts of Venezuela, and it's intensified a little bit. Now the problem is this, the opposition and Maduro have actually been in talks to try to stave off the inevitable to the point at which that it's been declared by others, hey, they're basically in default limbo. That they're in default technically speaking, but not 100%, and it's kind of this weird situation where there's no actual single term to categorize where their economy now falls, but it's not a functioning economy in the generally understood sense. At this point, Venezuela technically is a failed state on the economic level. On the social level, it's been a failed state for a few years. Since the recession hit there, you could call it essentially a depression at this point. There is no functioning economy on the local level in some cases. What has happened is that there is a chronic shortage of virtually everything, to the point at which even now I think some of their oil rigs ended up shutting down because they were no longer capable of functioning and even keeping themselves afloat. You've got unemployment, you've got starvation, you've got a lack of basic medical goods. They had to strike a deal with India to pay in oil in exchange for basic medicine, actually. That was interesting, and that actually could probably save tens of thousands of lives, so good on the Indian government for striking such a bargain. It's actually a little bit of a shining moment in an otherwise fairly dark recent half-decade for the nation of Venezuela. The biggest problem with Venezuela is that when Western voices weigh in to say, well, something might be wrong here, they say, oh, it's the great Satan. It's like people who want to take Venezuela apart, make it enslaved or something. The idea of Venezuela sort of determining its own future is just fine. Actually, when nations want to do that, like the UK leaving the EU, I support it. But the idea that Venezuelans would continue to support a Maduro-style central planning that got them into this mess in the first place under Chavez is rather strange. See, Chavez dies before all the problems begin, but he set the stage for the problems that then erupted. Now, it's a socialist paradise. It follows the heavily centrally planned sort of situation, sort of system, reliant upon a lot of bureaucrats and military chiefs and heavy-handed executive intervention. That's the kind of, unfortunately, economy you tend to need if you engage in a lot of socialism. Now, I've said before, for instance, a socialized program in and of itself as a standalone, healthcare subsidies of some sort, universal, pre-12 education, something like that is just fine. Some socialized program like that, well, it may be less efficient maybe than privatization, and you're sort of trading off some efficiency for, it being universally applicable, making sure that, people on the lower rungs, they don't fall through the cracks. That alone isn't the problem. The problem is that when you administer a socialized program, you tend to need a heavy-handed bureaucratic system to do so. Over time, it grows and becomes less efficient, and it tends to need central control. It tends to need top-down style, very hierarchical authority, which in turn becomes corrupt because it includes an element of power and prestige. It's the ever-present problem of having any socialism at all. You have to constrain it. I would say one of the biggest failings of our own founders was to constrain things on the fiscal side as opposed to just on the legalistic side of, the government can't abuse you in a judicial manner in such a way. The government can't force you to quarter troops in your home, but it never says, hey, the government can't compel you to pay a significant proportion of everything that you make, all of your productivity, regardless of the form, in order to prop up failing endeavors that get less and less efficient over time. That was never apparently in their minds. It's probably the biggest failing of our founders was arguably fiscal. If they had just constrained the total amount the government could ever take from its citizens as a proportion of their overall productivity on any given level, things would probably be fine because we wouldn't have, the government would have to pick and choose what kinds of socialistic endeavors it wants to engage in and what kinds of bureaucratic tenets it wants to associate with them because it would have to pay for them with a limited amount of cash and wouldn't be able to get around it. That and the idea of, limitless money printing, that's the separate issue. Venezuela, though, takes that basic same central problem that we have, and that money is the root of most of the evil that the government gets involved in, like the moralism and abuse. It's just a symptom of that same central problem. Venezuela takes that and amplifies it 100-fold. by being explicitly centrally planned and having a constitutional system that nobody apparently really cares about. It's as Maduro skirts it at a whim, controls the judiciary for the most part, skirts the constitution they do have in order to label the opposition-controlled legislature simply defunct. So he's like, well, I'm not going to listen to you anymore, and I have control of the military, so there's not a whole lot you can do. Oddly enough, there was a time, I can't remember which president it was, but there was one time, I think it was Jackson, if I remember correctly, gets slapped in the cock by the courts, and he says, okay, that's fine, the court's made its decision, now let them enforce it. And they can't do that. And that risks an imperialistic style of presidency. Here it's more constrained anyway, even if someone does try to do something like that. Bush, he loved to ignore the Constitution. Obama loved to ignore it. Trump, unfortunately, will probably do the same thing in due time. In Venezuela, though, it's sort of par for the course. It's the norm that Maduro says, fuck it, basically. So more looting. They also had a raid on that one dude who supposedly stole a helicopter and was like dropping grenades on their parliament building or something, or their Supreme Court building, I can't remember. I think they claim they killed him and a few others. And they're saying, oh, it was a counterterrorism operation. Really? Though, if you oppose Maduro's government, you probably call them freedom fighters. Now, isn't this interesting? Because it's essentially the flip side of maybe what the Obama admin would say about Al-Qaeda or something, or the Bush admin or something. It's sort of the rough counterpart, only inverted, for the Western world because it happens to be happening in the American hemisphere in a nation we don't get along with. So it's always interesting to see the double standard perhaps applied there when you have a roughly similar situation. You got socialist guerrillas there. They operate much the same way that a Taliban would operate, other than they're in the jungle instead of in a cave somewhere up in the mountains. It's interesting to see, and Venezuela probably survives intact, but it's a matter of how many more people are going to die because, hey, I can't get my inhaler. I couldn't get the insulin, or, not that anyone's going to develop diabetes when nobody in Venezuela can possibly get obese, and like they have to walk 10 miles to get to the bread line every day, so they're getting plenty of exercise. I can't wait until the socialists here say, oh, everyone in Venezuela, there's no obesity crisis there. We should model things after them. Obviously, we need to do what Maduro's doing, because look at how healthy people are getting. Look, there's no fat on them. It's like Weight Watchers the country. It's so great. By the way, you remember Slim Fast? Throw back to the 90s and 2000s, I think, late 90s. I can remember those things, back when people were drinking sugary bullshit and thinking that it made them thin. Pure Americana. Yeah, you're going to lose weight with this massive sugary slurry of bullshit and chemicals. It's going to be great. Now, I bet a bunch of Venezuelans wish that they would have some airlifted Slim Fast because it'd be way more food than anything that they're getting. Although there's a sugar shortage there too. They can't even get enough sugar to keep the factories that make soda running. They make their diabetes syrup, and then, in Latin America, stuff like Coca-Cola, it's actually really, really popular. Like, if you think fat Americans stereotype, oh, they suck down Coca-Cola for breakfast, they put it in baby bottles. Okay, keep thinking that. I think there are other locations in this world that are more addicted to sugar, arguably, than here. Here, they pump it into the breads, usually. They put it into pastries and shit. When they could, substitute something healthier like, a pound of fucking butter like maybe a French person would do. It's probably healthier than what we do, typically. It's more like in Australia where they have that fairy bread stuff, and it's like, what, the sugar syrup and sprinkles on a toast or something, and it's considered a delicacy, or maybe they just pretend. I think the same's true of Vegemite, to tell the truth. I think they just pretend that Australians routinely enjoy smearing it on toast. Because I tried it and it tastes like celery salt. It's basically a celery salt, the paste, only it's brown instead of, celery salt colored. Sort of a blackish, whitish, odd, salt and pepper sort of color. So yeah, I feel sorry for the people of Venezuela. It's like a lot of times people say, oh, those Americans, they hate everyone around the world is different. No, it's not a case of hating the Venezuelans. It's looking at them looting and rioting and starving and kids dying because they don't get an inhaler or something. It's actually quite upsetting and sad. Maduro is an idiot. He's also a psychopath. He probably should have been killed off years ago. I can remember back when I think it was Pat Robertson said, oh, well, we should just assassinate Chavez. You know, it's beginning to look a little bit like that may have not been a terrible idea after all. People laughed about it at the time. God, when was that? That was over a decade ago. Now, I can only vaguely remember it. It was so long ago. I think it was easily in the middle of the Bush administration. Now, which is why maybe the Bush ad people were worried because they thought Bush would take such suggestions seriously. Maybe it was the right idea at the time. Maybe it should have been done. It would have saved them a lot of trouble. Maybe they wouldn't be under a socialist dictatorship right now. That's about all. Peace out.